first read Gloria Anzaldúa's La conciencia de la mestiza, Towards a New Consciousness, last year, and honestly, on my first read, I didn't fully understand it. La conciencia de la mestiza, Towards a New Consciousness, is the 7th chapter of Anzaldúa's book, Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza, in which she discusses the experience of Chicanos and Latinas who experience life on the border. When I first read this, I was slightly confused by the call for a new consciousness and the implications of this. But once I began to read other Latina feminist philosophers like Mariana Ortega and Maria Lugones, I started to better understand what Anzaldúa is arguing. Latino people living in the US have a unique experience of liminality that members of other marginalized identity groups don't share. Theirs is one that comes from an internal strife of their colonized ancestors as well as their colonizer ancestors. So this call for a new consciousness is a unique strategy of resistance for those who exist at the borderlands. Mestiza is a term that refers to a woman who is of mixed European and indigenous descent, specifically imperial settler Iberians and indigenous Americans. Because of her mixed identity, the mestiza walks between cultures. Her existence is one marked by liminality, internal strife, and ambiguity. She's caught between multiple cultures at once. Anzaldúa uses the phrase mental nepentalism, nepentalism being an Aztec word meaning torn between ways, to describe the constant state that the mestiza finds herself in. The mestiza experiences a perpetual state of liminality, deriving from her marginal position as a woman of many different cultures, as a result of European colonization. She's never fully a part of one culture because she walks the line between all of the different cultures which she's a part of. Another struggle which the mestiza faces is the conflicting messages from the different cultures she's a part of. Her different cultures all pull her in different ways, which leaves the mestiza with the problem of deciding which culture she must listen to. Anzaldúa writes that, cradled in one culture, sandwiched between two cultures, straddling all three cultures and their value systems, the mestiza undergoes a struggle of flesh, a struggle of borders, an inner war. The mestiza is plagued by internal conflict as she struggles mixed messaging from the different selves within her. The strife which the mestiza experiences is a twofold strife. The first part is that the mestiza comes from epistemically divergent contexts. These different contexts have different social, cultural, and ontological interpretations of reality, which results in the individual being pulled in different directions. What follows from this is the second part of the strife. This pulling in multiple directions can result in a clash of the two cultures. This is a unique type of cultural clash, though, because it comes from having two races in their psyches, the conquerors and the conquered. Not only is she a part of different cultures, but these cultures are in direct opposition to one another, the colonizer and the colonized. This only adds to the mental distress that the mestiza feels. Anzaldúa explains that the way the mestiza learns to endure this internal strife is by developing a tolerance for ambiguity. She posits a new mestiza identity. The new mestiza doesn't identify with just one side of the cultural binaries she experiences. She breaks down these binaries in order to fully recognize all aspects of the Borderlands experience. The mestiza has a plural personality. She exists as a part of all cultures. She doesn't discard any of the cultures that she's a part of. Instead, she fully embraces them all. The creation of the Mestiza consciousness comes as a result of trying to synthesize the identities of the mestiza. Anzaldúa writes that in attempting to work out a synthesis, the self has added a third element, which is greater than the sum of its two parts. That third element is a new consciousness, a Mestiza consciousness. The Mestiza consciousness is a particular experience for Chicanos, especially those living on the US-Mexico border. It is an intersectional culture, ethnicity, race, and gender, and was, for Anzaldúa, a way to theorize her lived experience of living in multiple overlapping contexts. The Mestiza consciousness is a consciousness of the Borderlands, as she calls it. It's a more holistic way of understanding the self, not as a self split into parts, but as a self that walks the borders between identities. In her essay on Borderlands, La Frontera, an interpretive essay, Maria Lugones builds on the idea of the dual hyphenated personality, which would directly oppose the Mestiza consciousness. She says that this idea is an Anglo creation. It's only within the Anglo mind that people are capable of keeping the cultures separate rather than experiencing them together. The Mestiza consciousness allows for the Mestiza to experience the plurality of her existence, rather than keeping her different cultures and identities separate from one another. Anzaldúa writes that the first step towards this new Mestiza identity is to take inventory of the self, recognizing all that she has and from where it's come. Though it's difficult to differentiate between what has been inherited, what has been acquired, and what has been imposed. In taking inventory, the Mestiza can dislodge the epistemic imperialism that posits that the right ways of knowing are found through European culture. A primary source of oppression for Anzaldúa is Occidental dualistic thinking. This is a common way of thinking in Western cultures, which situates things within a binary, or dualism. It was also especially apparent through the hierarchical binaries that were introduced by Spanish culture, which obscured the Mesoamerican ways of thinking, which centralized non-exclusionary binaries. So by discarding this dualist way of thinking, the Mestiza can come to understand the alternate ways of knowing. The existence of the new Mestiza is one of resistance. She resists the hegemonic borders that suppress her full identity. And Anzaldúa sees this new consciousness as a liberational tool, above all. The struggle of the Mestiza is a feminist one, so part of the work of the Mestiza is to help change the sexist nature of Mexican and indigenous culture, especially the sexism found in Chicanos. Anzaldúa discusses the idea of being macho and how the man's machismo is a response to poverty and oppression and low self-esteem. The Chicano is never at ease. In the white world, he feels powerless. With Latinos, he feels inadequate, especially because of language inadequacy. And around Native Americans, he feels guilt from the Spanish part of himself, which colonized them. Because of this, he feels a deep sense of racial shame. So, Anzaldúa says that it's necessary that the Mestiza doesn't forget about the men. In order to undo the sexism inherent to their culture, the Mestiza must not leave men behind. They must support each other in working towards equality because it's a shared struggle. In Elena Ruiz's chapter, Mestiza Consciousness, from 50 Concepts for Critical Phenomenology, she raises two of the main critiques against Anzaldúa's work on Mestiza Consciousness. The first is related to the exclusion of Black identities. In her work, Anzaldúa focuses primarily on Mexican, Indigenous, and white identities, leaving behind Black identities, which is notable given the history of anti-Black racism in Latin America. With the abundance of Afro-Latinas who have similar liminal identities and struggles, how does their borderland experience differ? Professor Silvana Falcon addresses this issue by expanding on Anzaldúa's notion of Mestiza consciousness and putting it in conversation with the Du Boisian notion of double consciousness to explain the experience of Afro-Latina women who also exist at the borderland. In her work, she interviewed several Afro-Peruvian women who discussed their borderland experience. She concluded that their double consciousness allows them to understand the racism inflicted on them, while their mestiza consciousness is what led them to react to this racism. It also adds a gendered element to Du Bois' double consciousness. It's thus a more holistic way of understanding the borderland experience for all women who exist there. The second critique claims that mestiza consciousness is still tied to settler colonial thinking, which helps to erase native identities. She primitivizes indigeneity in her exploration of the Nepantala state. Andrea Smith claims that Anzaldúa's call for a tolerance for ambiguity situates Indians and Europeans in a dichotomy that can be healed through mestizaje. This view positions Indians as rigid with no tolerance for change or deviance. So while the mestiza consciousness can be seen as a useful epistemic resource for those in these liminal positions at the borderland, it is equally important to recognize the other forms of resistance to colonial domination, especially ones that are more inclusive and can account for multiple existences on the borderland.